In this video, we're briefly going to talk about some of the scope issues within AngularJS. I'm going to start by creating a new file, and we'll just call this one index.html. And I'm going to add my Angular script tag and an HTML file. And we're going to start, I'm going to create a div, and I'm going to call this ng-app. And this time I'm going to give the app a name. I'm just going to call it my app to create our application. And then I'm going to create an input and I'm not going to wrap this input in a controller. It's just going to live within the app context here. And I'm going to say ng model quantity. Okay. And now I'm going to create another div, and this div will actually attach to a controller. So I'm going to say div ng controller, and I'm going to call this scope controller. Okay, so now this area will have a controller attached to it, and I'll add an input text. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to call it ng model, and I'm going to use the same name. I'm going to say ng model quantity. So now we've got two text boxes, each named quantity, one within the app context and one within my ng controller context. And then we just need to add a script tag, and I'll reference my scope controller JS. Oops. And we'll save. So now that we have the HTML file, we'll create our scope controller. And in here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to define an object for my app. I'm going to say my app equals Angular module my app, and that'll give this will create the context of the app. It'll name it my app, which matches up to the name I used in the HTML, and then we can also optionally give it a list of dependencies to be injected. We'll talk about dependency injection later. And then I'm going to create my controller. So scope controller, and we'll say it gets $scope. Now $scope is injected by Angular into our controller when it gets instantiated. And I'm just going to save that. We don't even have to put anything into this controller to illustrate what I want to show you. So I'll bring up a live preview. All right, so now we've got two text boxes here. And if we flip back over to the HTML, you'll remember the first one is outside of a controller, and the second one is inside of a controller. And you'll see something interesting here. So if we go to the first text box, and I type in first, you'll see that it updates both text boxes. And this is because initially, the controller inherits its parent scope. So quantity does not exist yet. As soon as we start typing in the first text box, that creates a property on the model called quantity and assigns it the value of what I type in that text box. And then the controller, it doesn't have a quantity defined locally within itself, so it inherits the scope from the parent. But now, interestingly, as soon as I start typing in the second text box, now it creates its own local quantity within its own scope, within the controller scope. So the two are disconnected. So this is something to remember when you're dealing with controllers. You're going to want to make sure that you're properly scoping your variables or remembering to do this so that you don't have any overlap and things writing on top of each other. Now, it might seem like a convenient way to communicate with two different controllers, but there are actually better ways, which we'll talk about later.